The wedding dress should have been white, but Mercy Whiteheart's tears had turned the worn lace gray as ash. Pastor Abraham Whiteheart's voice cracked on the sacred words, his own daughter's name catching in his throat like a bone. "Do you, Ezra Ironwolf, take this woman?" It wasn't a celebration. It was a transaction. The congregation shifted in their pews, wooden seats groaning under the weight of whispered judgments. Mrs. Henderson's Bible slipped from her trembling fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like thunder. Little Tommy Fisher buried his face in his mother's skirts, sensing something terrible in the air. Mercy's hand rested on her swelling belly, 6 months of shame made visible. Her father hadn't asked who the father was, hadn't asked anything at all, just dragged her from her bed 3 nights ago with rope burns still raw on her wrists. "I do," Ezra's voice rumbled like distant mountains. What kind of man accepts a pregnant girl as payment for an old debt? And what would become of them both in those God-forsaken hills? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Redemption Hollow had earned its name through blood and broken dreams. Nestled deep in the Tennessee mountains, where the morning mist clung to ancient Cherokee hunting grounds, the town of barely 300 souls scratched out existence from coal seams that grew thinner each passing year. The war had taken their young men. The mining company had taken their hope. All that remained was a stubborn faith that tomorrow might hurt less than today. Pastor Abraham Whiteheart ruled this dying congregation with an iron fist wrapped in Scripture. At 52, consumption gnawed at his lungs like a hungry wolf, though he'd hidden the bloody handkerchiefs from his daughter for months. His weathered hands still commanded respect when they gripped the pulpit. His voice still thundered divine judgment from lips that tasted of copper and approaching death. He'd built his reputation on moral certainty, preaching that God's punishment was swift and his mercy earned through suffering. But watching his only daughter's belly swell with unmarried shame had brought Abraham to his knees in ways the war never could. Mercy Whiteheart possessed her mother's Cherokee cheekbones and her father's stubborn spirit, though 19 years of rigid Scripture had taught her to hide both behind downcast eyes and folded hands. Her skin held the warm bronze of her grandmother's people, a heritage Pastor Abraham had spent decades trying to pray away. She moved through the world like a deer scenting wolves, alert, graceful, ready to bolt. The townspeople whispered she'd inherited her grandmother's heathen ways, along with her exotic beauty, as if wildness were passed down through bloodline like eye color or the shape of one's hands. 3 months ago, Jacob Ashford had whispered promises sweeter than honey into her willing ears. The mayor's golden-haired son, destined for law school back east, had sworn their secret meetings behind the schoolhouse were rehearsals for a proper courtship. When her monthly courses stopped coming, Mercy had run to him with joy sparkling in her dark eyes, expecting a proposal. Instead, she'd found him packing for Nashville, his father's money already securing his escape from small-town entanglements. "You seduced my boy!" Mayor Ashford had snarled when she'd knocked on their door with desperate courage. "Jezebel blood will out, I suppose." Ezra Stone Ironwolf owned 300 acres of mountainside that nobody else wanted, and a reputation that kept even the bravest men from his door. The Cherokee called him Envy Asga, Rock Ghost, a white man who'd learned their ways and disappeared into the hills like smoke. Veterans whispered he'd done terrible things during the war, things that carved hollow spaces behind his pale blue eyes. Some claimed he'd taken a Cherokee wife who'd vanished under mysterious circumstances. Others swore he could call bears from their dens and speak to the spirits that haunted these ancient ridges. Pastor Abraham owed Ezra Ironwolf a debt that predated Mercy's birth, sealed with blood and witnessed by God himself. Now, with death rattling in his chest and scandal blooming in his daughter's womb, he'd decided how that debt would be paid. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts through mud still soft from yesterday's rain as Ezra guided his team up the treacherous mountain path. Mercy sat rigid beside him, her wedding dress now travel-stained and wrinkled, one hand clutching the wagon's side while the other pressed protectively over her belly. The baby had been kicking all morning, as if sensing the upheaval in its small world. "How much farther?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the creaking wheels and snorting horses. Ezra's weathered hands never loosened their grip on the reins. "Another hour, maybe 2. Depends on whether that creek's still passable." It was the longest sentence he'd spoken since loading her meager possessions. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and a small wooden box containing her grandmother's jewelry that Pastor Abraham hadn't discovered and sold. Everything else she'd ever owned now belonged to her father's church, donated to pay for her sin. The path wound higher through dense stands of oak and hickory, their leaves just beginning to hint at autumn's approach. Mercy had never been this far from Redemption Hollow, never seen the valley spread below like a patchwork quilt sewn by God's own hand. Under different circumstances, she might have marveled at the beauty. Instead, each turn of the wheels carried her further from everything familiar into a future dark as the shadows gathering between the trees. "Your father said you can cook," Ezra said suddenly. "Some." Mercy's grandmother had taught her Cherokee recipes in secret: wild onion soup, ash cakes, rabbit stewed with ramps. But Pastor Abraham had forbidden such heathen practices after Grandma Sarah had been sent away. "I know basic meals: biscuits, salt pork, beans." Ezra nodded once, as if checking items off a mental list. "Can you tend a garden?" "Yes, sir." "Handle chickens? Milk a goat?" I can learn." He glanced at her then, pale blue eyes assessing without judgment. "Good. Winter comes early up here. We'll need every hand working if we mean to survive it." The word "we" hit Mercy like a physical blow. She'd spent 3 days in numb shock, convinced she was being delivered to some mountain hermit who'd use her body and discard her when he tired of her company. But Ezra spoke of winter preparations, of survival that included both of them. It was the first spark of hope she'd felt since Jacob Ashford had looked through her like she was nothing more than shadow and regret. They stopped beside a rushing creek to rest the horses. Ezra unhitched the team with practiced efficiency, while Mercy climbed down carefully, her balance awkward with the growing weight she carried. The water ran clear over smooth stones, cold enough to make her gasp when she cupped it in her palms to drink. "This creek runs year-round," Ezra said, watering the horses downstream. "Fed by springs up near the ridge. Even in the worst droughts, it never runs dry." Mercy nodded, filing the information away. Everything about this place would matter now. Which plants were safe to eat, where the winter winds hit hardest, how to read the signs that warned of storms rolling down from the peaks. She was no longer Pastor Abraham's sheltered daughter, protected by his authority and feared reputation. She was Ezra Ironwolf's what? Wife seemed too strong a word for whatever they'd become through ritual and necessity. "Can I ask you something?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Ezra straightened slowly, water dripping from his cupped hands. "Ask." "Why did you agree to this? My father's debt. Surely there were other ways to settle it." For a long moment, only the creek's burbling filled the silence. Then Ezra dried his hands on his pants and looked directly at her, those pale eyes holding depth she couldn't fathom. "Your father saved my life once, pulled me out of a river when I was too drunk and stupid to save myself, said God had plans for me that didn't include drowning like a fool." He paused, studying the mountains that rose around them like sleeping giants. "Maybe this is what he had in mind." "And if it's not?" Mercy asked quietly. "If God made a mistake?" Ezra's mouth curved in what might have been a smile if it had reached his eyes. "Then I reckon we'll find out together." He hitched the horses again, and they resumed their climb into whatever waited at the top of the mountain. Mercy touched her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly beneath her palm. "Hold on, little one," she whispered. "We're almost home." The word tasted strange on her tongue, but for the first time since this nightmare began, it didn't taste like a lie. The cabin sat in a clearing carved from wilderness like a prayer answered in wood and stone. 2 stories of hand-hewn logs chinked with clay and moss, a stone chimney releasing a thin thread of smoke into the September sky. Split rail fences enclosed a kitchen garden where late tomatoes hung heavy on the vine and corn stalks rustled secrets to the mountain wind. A barn weathered gray as old bones housed tools and winter hay while chickens pecked hopefully around Ezra's boots as he helped Mercy down from the wagon. "It's beautiful," she breathed, meaning it. After the cramped parsonage where every board creaked judgment and every corner held her father's watchful presence, this place felt like sanctuary. Ezra's expression remained unreadable. "It's practical. Beauty's a luxury these mountains don't often allow." He shouldered her bundle of possessions and led her up the porch steps, worn smooth by years of boots. The door opened without ceremony into a single large room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table commanded the center, surrounded by chairs that had been carved with obvious skill if not artistry. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, preserving jars, and things she couldn't identify in the dim light. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately, who wasted nothing and valued function over form. "Your room's upstairs," Ezra said, setting her bundle on the table. "I sleep down here by the fire." Mercy felt heat rise in her cheeks. Of course he wouldn't. They weren't really married, no matter what words had been spoken over them. This was a business arrangement, a debt being paid. She should feel relieved. Instead, something that might have been disappointment twisted in her chest. The stairs led to a small loft space under the eaves, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest for her belongings. A single window looked out over the valley she'd climbed to reach this place. In the distance, smoke from Redemption Hollow's chimneys rose like incense toward heaven. "There's a chamber pot under the bed," Ezra called from below. "Privy's behind the house, but night walking's not safe. Too many things hunting in the dark." When she came back downstairs, he was laying kindling in the fireplace with the same methodical precision he seemed to bring to everything. "You hungry?" "A little." The baby had been pressing against her ribs all day, making eating uncomfortable, but she needed to keep her strength up, needed to prove she could be useful rather than burden. Ezra nodded toward a bucket by the door. "Water's from the spring. Should fill that every morning, first thing. Kitchen's through there." He pointed to a doorway she hadn't noticed. "Beans in the pot should still be warm. Help yourself." The kitchen was smaller than the main room, but efficiently arranged. Shelves held dishes, pots, preserved foods, and glass jars. A window over the basin looked out toward the barn where she could see Ezra unhitching the horses, his movements economical and sure. She ladled beans into a bowl, surprised to find them seasoned with herbs she couldn't identify, but that tasted of wild places and forgotten knowledge. She was washing her bowl when the door to what she'd assumed was a pantry swung open under her searching hand. Inside, narrow stairs led down into darkness that smelled of earth and stored vegetables. A root cellar, she realized, the kind every mountain family needed to survive the winter. But as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she saw something that made her heart skip. Hanging from pegs along one wall were tiny clothes, a baby's gown sewn from soft cotton, small quilts folded neat as prayer books, wooden toys carved with the same skilled hands that had shaped the chairs upstairs. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, stood a cradle. Pine boards rubbed smooth with beeswax, rockers worn thin from use, a small quilt still folded inside as if waiting for the child who would never come. Mercy backed up the stairs so fast she nearly fell, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from crying out, understanding flooding through her like cold water. Ezra had been married before, had a child before, and somehow he'd lost them both. "Find what you needed?" Ezra's voice behind her made her jump. She spun around, guilt written plain across her face. "I was looking for... I thought it was a pantry. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to..." "Doesn't matter." His voice carried no anger, but something had shuddered behind his eyes. "Those stairs are steep. Baby you're carrying makes everything harder to balance. Best stay out of there." He moved past her to pump water into a basin, his shoulders rigid with tension. Mercy watched him scrub his hands with soap that smelled of lye and pine pitch, wondering what tragedy had carved those hollow spaces behind his eyes. Had his wife died in childbirth? Had the baby lived long enough to use those carefully crafted toys? Questions burned on her tongue, but the set of his jaw warned against asking. "I'll show you around the property tomorrow," Ezra said without looking at her. Garden needs harvesting before the first frost. Chickens need feeding twice daily. Goats get milked morning and evening. There's work enough for both of us. "Of course, I want to help. I want to earn my keep." He finally turned to look at her, those pale eyes searching her face for something she couldn't name. "This isn't about earning anything. Your father paid his debt. You're here because you need to be here. And I..." He paused, jaw working as if chewing on words too hard to swallow. "I need someone to need this place the way it deserves to be needed. The way I can't anymore." The baby chose that moment to kick hard enough to make Mercy gasp and press her hand to her side. Ezra's gaze dropped to where her palm curved over her belly, and for just an instant something raw and hungry flickered across his features before disappearing behind that careful mask he wore. "You should rest," he said quietly. "Mountain air takes getting used to. Tomorrow we start over." The first week passed in careful circles around each other, like wild animals learning to share the same watering hole. Mercy woke each morning to the sound of Ezra's boots on the porch and the rhythmic thunk of his axe splitting kindling. By the time she dressed and made her way downstairs, he'd already milked the goats, fed the chickens, and started coffee in the blue enamel pot that seemed older than sin itself. "Morning," he'd say without looking up from whatever task occupied his hands. "Good morning," she'd reply, and they'd move through their separate routines like dancers who'd never learned to touch. But slowly, inevitably, their worlds began to intersect. It started with the garden. Mercy had claimed she could tend vegetables, but her father's small plot behind the parsonage had been tame compared to Ezra's sprawling maze of beans climbing cornstalks, squash vines spreading like green tentacles, and herbs she couldn't identify growing in careful rows. When she bent to pull what she thought were weeds, Ezra appeared beside her with the soundless step that made her wonder if he'd learned to walk from the Cherokee whose hunting grounds these had once been. "That's wild ginger," he said, crouching beside her. "Good for settling stomachs, babies in the womb especially." His calloused fingers brushed hers as he showed her the difference between the valuable roots and the invasive grasses that threatened to choke them. "Your grandmother would have known it. Sarah Crowfeather was famous for her healing knowledge before your father had her sent away." Mercy's hand stilled in the dirt. "You knew my grandmother?" "Some. She traded remedies for tools back when I first came to these mountains." "Said you had her eyes." Ezra's own eyes focused on something distant. "Said you'd need her knowledge someday, whether your father allowed it or not." That afternoon, Ezra began teaching her to read the mountain's language. How to identify which mushrooms would heal and which would kill, where to find wild onions and ramps hiding in the forest understory, which berries could be dried for winter medicine, and which should be left for the bears, who would soon begin their frantic preparation for the long sleep ahead. "Your body's making a person," he said matter-of-factly as they walked a deer trail that wound between ancient oaks. "That takes strength most food can't give. Mountain knows what you need, if you know how to ask." Mercy pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby's restless movement beneath her palm. "How do you know so much about this?" She gestured toward her growing roundness. Ezra's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A man learns what he needs to learn. It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging whatever tragedy had left those baby clothes hanging in the root cellar like ghosts of hopes that had died too young. Mercy didn't push. She was learning that Ezra revealed himself in actions rather than words, in the way he carved a more comfortable chair for her changing body, in how he left bowls of wild strawberries on the kitchen table without comment, in the gentle way he corrected her mistakes without making her feel foolish. The second week brought Jacob's first letter. Mercy found it tucked under a stone on the porch when she went to gather eggs, her name written in Jacob's familiar hand across paper that smelled of the cologne he'd worn during their secret meetings. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal, hope and dread warring in her chest. "My dearest Mercy," it began, "I have been in agony since learning of your situation. Father has forbidden me from contacting you, but love finds a way. I am working to convince him that we can weather this scandal together. Wait for me. Do not let that mountain savage touch what belongs to me. I will come for you before the baby arrives. Your devoted Jacob." And the paper fluttered from Mercy's numb fingers like a wounded bird. Even now, even after abandoning her to face the consequences alone, Jacob spoke of her as property to be reclaimed. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and she pressed both hands over the place where new life grew despite the circumstances of its conception. "Bad news?" Mercy spun around to find Ezra watching her from the barn doorway, pitchfork in hand, his pale eyes taking in her pale face and the letter at her feet. It's from—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ezra walked over and picked up the paper, scanning it quickly before folding it with deliberate care. "Jacob Ashford. Should have figured he'd try something like this." "You know him?" "Know of him. Mayor's son. Thinks the world owes him whatever he wants, just for being born with his father's name." Ezra handed the letter back to her. "Question is, what do you want to do about it?" The simple question hit Mercy like a physical blow. When had anyone last asked what she wanted? Her father decided her fate based on scripture and social standing. Jacob had taken what he wanted without considering the cost to her. Even this marriage had been arranged without her consent. But now Ezra stood waiting for her answer as if her opinion actually mattered. "I don't know," she whispered honestly. "Part of me still loves him. The part that remembers how he used to quote poetry and promise we'd see the ocean together someday. And the other part? The other part knows that love was for someone who never really existed." Ezra nodded slowly. "Feelings don't change overnight just because circumstances do, but feelings and choices are different things. You can love a memory and still choose the life that's real." That night, Mercy burned Jacob's letter in the fireplace and watched the words that had once moved her turn to ash and smoke. Ezra sat in his chair across from her, oiling his rifle with methodical strokes, saying nothing but somehow managing to communicate that whatever choice she made, she wouldn't face the consequences alone. The third week brought the first hint of winter's approach. Mercy woke to find frost silvering the pumpkin leaves and her breath misting in the cold air. Ezra had already started the fire and put coffee on to boil, but she noticed him favoring his left leg as he moved around the kitchen. "Old wound?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Old foolishness," he replied, but without the edge that usually accompanied questions about his past. "Caught some Confederate lead during the war." "Aches when the weather changes." Mercy remembered her grandmother's stories about treating pain with heat and herbs. "I could make a poultice, willow bark and wintergreen if you have any." Ezra looked at her with something that might have been respect. "Your grandmother teach you that?" "Before Papa sent her away. He said healing was women's work, but herb knowledge was too close to witchcraft for a Christian household." "Your grandmother was one of the wisest people these mountains ever held," Ezra said quietly. "Foolish man, your father, thinking wisdom could be separated from its source." As Mercy prepared the poultice, grinding dried herbs with a mortar and pestle she found in the kitchen, she felt something shift between them. The careful distance they'd maintained began to crack, revealing the possibility of something deeper than mere coexistence. "Roll up your pant leg," she instructed, surprised by her own confidence. Ezra complied, revealing a scarred calf where a rifle ball had torn through muscle and bone before army surgeons had dug it out with whiskey for anesthesia and prayers for luck. Mercy's breath caught at the evidence of pain he'd carried for so many years without complaint. "This might sting at first," she warned, applying the warm poultice with gentle hands. Instead of stinging, Ezra's breath released in a long sigh of relief. "Where did you learn to do that?" "Grandma Sarah used to say healing was in my hands. Said it was a gift from the Creator that couldn't be prayed away no matter how hard Papa tried." She was right. Ezra's voice held wonder, as if he'd forgotten that touch could bring comfort instead of pain. "Haven't felt this good in years." Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary. Mercy felt heat that had nothing to do with the poultice spreading through her chest, and from the way Ezra's breathing changed, she suspected he felt it too. But then the baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp and press her hand to her side, and the moment shattered like ice on stone. "Getting stronger," Ezra observed, his voice carefully neutral again. "Seems to be most active when I'm trying to rest," Mercy said, rubbing the spot where tiny feet pressed against her ribs. "Smart baby. Knows it needs to be strong for whatever's coming." The words hung between them like a promise and a warning. Winter was coming, with its harsh tests of preparation and endurance. Jacob was out there somewhere, plotting his return. And somewhere in the space between them, something new was growing that had nothing to do with the child she carried, and everything to do with the careful way they'd begun to trust each other with their broken pieces. That night, as Mercy lay in her narrow bed listening to wind rattle the shutters, she felt the baby settle into sleep for the first time in weeks. Her hand curved protectively over the place where new life grew, and for the first time since Jacob had looked through her like she was nothing, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this strange new life might hold more hope than heartbreak. Downstairs, she could hear Ezra moving restlessly around the main room, and she wondered if he was thinking the same thoughts that kept her staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons in mountain survival, new opportunities to learn whether the careful partnership they'd built could weather the storms that were surely coming. But tonight, for the first time since her world had collapsed, Mercy Whiteheart fell asleep feeling safe. October arrived with a vengeance, bringing early snows that dusted the peaks and sent the wildlife into frantic preparation for winter's siege. Mercy had grown round as a harvest moon, her belly preceding her through doorways like a proclamation of the life stirring within. The baby seemed to sense the changing seasons, growing more active as the days shortened, pressing tiny feet against her ribs as if testing the boundaries of its small world. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when the riders appeared. At first she thought it was Ezra, returning from his weekly trip to trade furs for supplies in the settlement 5 miles down the mountain. But these horses moved with purpose rather than the measured pace of a man who knew his way home. Mercy's blood turned to ice water when she recognized the lead rider's golden hair catching the weak autumn sunlight. Jacob Ashford sat his father's finest stallion like a conquering hero, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize, but whose hard faces and heavy coats marked them as the kind of help money could buy. Behind them rode Mayor Ashford himself, his political smile nowhere in evidence as he surveyed Ezra's humble homestead with obvious distaste. "Mercy!" Jacob's voice carried across the clearing like a bell calling the faithful to worship. "My darling, look what that monster has done to you." She pressed both hands protectively over her belly, the baby responding to her fear with restless kicks. "You shouldn't be here, Jacob." "Shouldn't be here?" Jacob dismounted with theatrical flourish, his city clothes immaculate despite the rough mountain trail. "I should have come sooner. When I heard what your father had done, how he'd sold you to this savage like a piece of livestock." He gestured toward the cabin with obvious revulsion. "No woman should have to endure such barbarism." "I'm fine," Mercy said, but her voice lacked conviction. The truth was more complicated than fine, woven through with tentative trust, and the growing realization that Ezra's quiet kindness was healing wounds she hadn't known she carried. "Fine?" Mayor Ashford spurred his horse closer, his politician's eyes cataloging every detail of her condition. "Young lady, you're living in sin with a man who's not your husband in the eyes of God or law. That ceremony your father performed was nothing but pagan theater designed to salve his conscience." The words hit Mercy like physical blows. "My father is a ordained minister." "The marriage was arranged under duress," Jacob interrupted, moving closer with the predatory grace she remembered from their stolen meetings behind the schoolhouse. "You were forced into this unholy union without your consent. Any court in Tennessee would declare it invalid." "And what about our child?" The words escaped before Mercy could stop them, her hand moving instinctively to cradle her belly. "What becomes of the baby when you've had this marriage dissolved?" Something flickered across Jacob's handsome features. Distaste, calculation, the brief shadow of a man discovering that his romantic gesture came with unwanted complications. We'll work something out. Perhaps a foundling home, or you want to give away your own child?" Mercy's voice rose with disbelief and growing fury. "The baby you put in my belly with all your pretty promises?" One of the hired men shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, and Mayor Ashford's face darkened with political alarm. Clearly this wasn't how they'd expected this reunion to unfold. "Now see here," the mayor began, but his words were cut off by the sound of boots on gravel. Ezra emerged from the tree line like a force of nature, his rifle slung across his shoulder and 3 rabbits hanging from his belt. He took in the scene with those pale blue eyes that missed nothing, the armed strangers, Mercy's distressed face, the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. "Afternoon," he said mildly, as if finding armed men in his clearing was an everyday occurrence. "You gentlemen lost?" "Not lost," Jacob replied, puffing out his chest like a rooster asserting dominance. "I'm Jacob Ashford, and I've come for my woman." Ezra's gaze flicked to Mercy, reading something in her expression that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Your woman?" "The mother of my child," Jacob declared with righteous conviction, "stolen from me by her father's machinations and held here against her will." "That's so." Ezra's voice remained conversational, but Mercy noticed how his hand had drifted closer to the rifle. "Mercy, you being held against your will?" The question hung in the cold air like morning mist. Everyone waited for her answer. Jacob with confident expectation, Mayor Ashford with political calculation, the hired men with professional indifference. But it was Ezra's patient attention that mattered most, the way he waited for her words as if they carried weight in a world that had taught her they didn't. "No," Mercy said quietly. "I'm not being held against my will." Jacob's face flushed red above his carefully trimmed beard. "You don't know what you're saying. This man has obviously terrorized you into submission. Mercy, darling, remember what we had together. Remember the dreams we shared." "I remember," Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger. "I remember hiding like criminals because you were ashamed to be seen with me. I remember how quickly those dreams evaporated when loving me became inconvenient." "That wasn't my choice." Jacob's composure cracked, revealing the petulant boy beneath the gentleman's facade. "My father forbade the match until I could establish myself professionally. I was protecting our future." "You were protecting yourself," Mercy shot back. "And when protecting me became too difficult, you chose the easier path." Mayor Ashford urged his horse forward, clearly deciding diplomacy had failed. "Young woman, you're obviously not thinking clearly. The isolation, the primitive conditions, the influence of this—" He gestured toward Ezra with barely concealed disgust. "This savage has obviously corrupted your judgment." Ezra's laugh was soft and deadly. "Savage? Haven't heard that one in a while. You find something amusing?" One of the hired men spoke for the first time, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his hip. "Just thinking about the last man who called me that," Ezra replied conversationally. "They found pieces of him scattered across 3 counties. The casual way he said it made the threat more chilling than any shout or bluster could have managed." The hired man's hand froze, and even Mayor Ashford's political confidence seemed to waver. But Jacob, inflated with righteousness and his father's money, pushed forward. "Are you threatening us?" "Wouldn't dream of it," Ezra said mildly. "Just making conversation while I decide what to do about uninvited guests who've come armed to my home and started making demands of my wife." "She's not your wife." Jacob's voice cracked like a teenager's. That mockery of a ceremony was performed under duress by a man trying to cover his own shame. "Mercy belongs with me, with people who understand her value." "And what value is that?" Ezra asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "She's—" Jacob fumbled for words. "She's beautiful, intelligent, from good family." "Breeding stock," Ezra observed. "That what you're saying?" "How dare you?" "Because that's all I'm hearing. Her bloodline, her appearance, her social connections, nothing about her courage or her healing hands or the way she sings while she works in the garden, nothing about the woman she is when nobody's trying to own her." Mercy felt tears prick her eyes, but not from sadness. For the first time in her life, someone was defending not what she represented, but who she was. "I've heard enough of this," Mayor Ashford declared, clearly deciding that retreat was the better part of political valor. "Mercy, we're prepared to offer you safe passage back to civilization. But this is your last chance. Once we leave, there'll be no rescue coming." "I don't need rescuing," Mercy said, her voice steady as mountain stone. "I need to be left alone to build the life I've chosen." Jacob's face contorted with rage and wounded pride. "You're making a mistake you'll regret for the rest of your life." "Maybe," Mercy replied. "But it'll be my mistake to make." The baby chose that moment to kick hard enough to make her gasp and double over slightly. Jacob's eyes went wide with what might have been genuine concern, but it was Ezra who moved, crossing the space between them in 3 quick strides to steady her with gentle hands. "Easy," he murmured. "Baby's just reminding everyone who he belongs to." "How do you know it's a boy?" Mercy asked, grateful for his solid presence beside her. "Just a feeling," Ezra replied, his pale eyes holding warmth she was still learning to trust. "Strong kicks like that usually mean a fighter." "This isn't over," Jacob snarled, mounting his horse with less grace than he'd dismounted. "Mercy, when you come to your senses, when you realize what kind of life you're condemning yourself and your child to, remember that I offered you better." "I'll remember," Mercy promised. "I'll remember everything." As the riders disappeared down the mountain trail, Mercy felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in months. The baby settled into peaceful stillness, as if it too sensed that a storm had passed without destroying their fragile sanctuary. "You all right?" Ezra asked, his hand still gentle on her shoulders. "Better than all right," Mercy replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time since this all began, I feel like I made a choice instead of having one made for me." Ezra nodded, understanding flickering in those pale eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little. "Choices are all any of us really have. The rest is just noise." That night, as wind rattled the shutters and the first real snow of the season began to fall, Mercy lay in her narrow bed listening to Ezra move around the main room below. The baby was restless again, responding to her elevated emotions with tiny kicks and rolls that made sleep impossible. She was contemplating going downstairs for some of the chamomile tea Ezra had shown her how to make when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound that took her a moment to identify. Carving. Ezra was carving something in the firelight, his knife working wood with the same patient precision he brought to everything else. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Winter was coming in earnest, and Jacob's visit had reminded her that the outside world wouldn't simply forget about her because she'd found peace in these mountains. But tonight, with snow falling soft as blessing and the sound of creation drifting up through the floorboards, Mercy Whiteheart felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the deep security of being exactly where she belonged. The contractions began at dawn on the first day of November, starting as a low ache in Mercy's back that she mistook for sleeping wrong on the narrow bed. She moved carefully down the stairs, one hand gripping the rail while the other pressed against her spine, expecting the discomfort to ease as she worked the stiffness from her joints. Ezra was already up, as always, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil. He glanced at her pale face and the careful way she moved, his pale eyes missing nothing. "Baby giving you trouble?" he asked, not looking up from the kindling. "Just restless," Mercy replied, though something deep in her bones whispered that this was different. The ache wrapped around her middle like a belt, tightening, holding her breath hostage for 30 seconds before releasing her with a gasp. "How often?" Ezra's voice carried the calm of a man who'd seen birth and death in equal measure. "How often what?" But even as she asked, another wave crested through her belly, stronger this time, making her grip the back of a chair until her knuckles went white. "The pains, how far apart are they?" Mercy tried to think through the haze of discomfort. "Maybe 10 minutes? 15? The admission made it real in a way that terrified her. "It's too early. I'm not ready." "Baby doesn't care if you're ready," Ezra said gently, abandoning his coffee to guide her to a chair. "First, babies come when they please, not when we expect them." The next contraction hit harder, stealing her breath and making her understand with crystalline clarity that her child was coming whether she felt prepared or not. Fear clawed at her throat, not just of the pain but of everything that could go wrong. Women died in childbirth every day, especially on isolated mountains miles from any doctor. "What if—" she began, but Ezra cut her off with a shake of his head. "No what-ifs. We take this one breath at a time." He moved around the cabin with efficient purpose, gathering clean linens, setting water to boil, pulling items from the cabinet that she hadn't known he possessed. Your grandmother would have known exactly what to do. Some of that knowledge is in your blood, whether your father wanted it there or not. As the morning wore on, the contractions grew stronger and closer together. Mercy paced the main room when she could, gripping furniture during the waves of pain that transformed her body into something she no longer recognized. Ezra stayed close but not hovering, offering water when she could drink it, cool cloths for her forehead when the pain made her sweat despite the November chill. "Tell me about your wife," Mercy gasped during a brief respite between contractions. "What was she like?" Ezra's hands stilled on the towel he was folding. "Why would you want to know that now?" "Because I need to think about something else. Because if I'm going to die up here, I want to know who came before me." "You're not going to die." Ezra's voice carried absolute conviction. "But her name was Morning Star, Cherokee, like your grandmother. Met her during the war when I was running dispatches through her people's territory." Another contraction built, but Mercy forced herself to focus on his words instead of the pain. "How did she die?" "She didn't." The admission came out flat, emotionless. "She left, took our son and disappeared one night while I was away hunting. Found a note saying she couldn't live the white man's way anymore, couldn't watch our boy grow up between two worlds that would never fully accept him." The contraction peaked, and Mercy cried out despite her efforts to stay quiet. When it passed, she stared at Ezra with new understanding. "The clothes in the root cellar belonged to Samuel. He'd be about 12 now if she kept him alive." Ezra's jaw worked as if chewing broken glass. "I looked for them for 2 years, followed every trail, asked every Cherokee I could find. It was like they'd been swallowed by the earth itself." "I'm sorry," Mercy whispered. But another contraction was building, stronger than anything that had come before. This one drove her to her knees beside the chair, her body demanding something she didn't understand. "That's it," Ezra said, his voice changing to the tone of command. "Baby's coming now." What followed was a blur of pain and purpose that stripped away everything civilized about Mercy Whiteheart and left only the ancient imperative of birth. Ezra guided her through each stage with steady hands and gentle words, somehow knowing exactly what she needed when she needed it. When she felt like she was drowning in sensation, he reminded her to breathe. When despair threatened to overwhelm her, he spoke of the child waiting to meet the world. When her strength failed, he lent her his own certainty that she could do this impossible thing. "I can see the head," he announced, wonder creeping into his voice. "Dark hair, lots of it. One more push, Mercy, just one more." She bore down with everything she had left, feeling her body tear and stretch beyond its limits. Then suddenly, impossibly, the pressure released in a rush of fluid and relief. A thin wail filled the cabin, the outraged cry of a soul thrust unwillingly into the cold world. "A girl," Ezra breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Perfect little girl." Through her tears, Mercy watched him lift the tiny, red-faced creature who had lived inside her for so long. His hands, so large and rough, cradled the baby with infinite gentleness as he cleared her airways and wrapped her in clean linen. When he placed the child on Mercy's chest, skin to skin, the baby's cries quieted to small huffs of indignation. "Hello, little one," Mercy whispered, touching the downy hair that was indeed dark as her own. "I'm your mama." The baby's eyes opened, unfocused but intensely blue, like mountain sky reflected in deep water. Like Ezra's eyes, Mercy realized with a start. But that was impossible. This child was Jacob's, conceived in stolen moments behind the schoolhouse when love had seemed as simple as sharing poetry and promises. "She's beautiful," Ezra said softly, his finger tracing the baby's tiny hand. "What will you call her?" Hope, Mercy replied without hesitation. Her name is Hope. As if responding to her name, the baby turned toward Mercy's voice, her small mouth working instinctively. Ezra helped position her for nursing, his touch clinical but gentle, and Mercy felt the sharp tug as Hope latched on with surprising strength. Natural as breathing, Ezra observed. She knows what she needs. The afternoon stretched into evening as Mercy dozed between nursing sessions, exhaustion settling into her bones like lead. Hope slept curled against her chest, tiny fingers occasionally flexing in dreams Mercy couldn't imagine. Ezra tended to both of them with quiet efficiency, changing linens, bringing broth when Mercy could manage it, keeping the fire built high against the November cold. It was nearly midnight when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind. Mercy's eyes snapped open, her body immediately tensing despite her exhaustion. Hope stirred restlessly, sensing her mother's alarm. "Expecting someone?" Ezra asked, but he was already reaching for his rifle. "No," Mercy whispered, though dread pooled in her stomach like ice water. "Jacob said it wasn't over." Ezra checked the rifle's load with movements made automatic by years of frontier living. "Stay with the baby. Don't come out no matter what you hear." But before he could reach the door, it exploded inward in a shower of splinters and winter air. Jacob Ashford stumbled into the cabin, his gentleman's clothes torn and muddy, his eyes wild with something that might have been desperation or madness. Behind him came the two hired men from his earlier visit, their faces grim with purpose. "Mercy!" Jacob's voice cracked like a whip. "Thank God we're not too late." "Too late for what?" Mercy clutched Hope closer, the baby beginning to fuss at the sudden noise and tension. "To save you from this madness." Jacob gestured wildly around the cabin. "Living like an animal in the wilderness, birthing your child without proper medical care. You could have died. The baby could have died." "But we didn't," Mercy said firmly. "We're both fine." Jacob's eyes fixed on the bundle in her arms, and something ugly flickered across his handsome features. "Let me see her. Let me see my daughter." Mercy's arms tightened protectively around Hope. "She's sleeping." "She's mine," Jacob snarled, all pretense of romantic concern vanishing. "My blood, my child, my responsibility. I'm taking both of you back to civilization where you belong." Ezra's rifle came up smooth as water. "I don't think so." The hired men drew their pistols in response, and suddenly the warm cabin where Hope had been born became a powder keg waiting for a spark. In her arms the baby began to cry, thin, desperate wails that seemed to pierce everyone's heart. "You're scaring her," Mercy said, her voice deadly quiet. "All of you. Put down your guns before you wake my daughter." But Jacob's face had gone pale, his eyes fixed on the crying infant with an expression Mercy couldn't read. Her eyes." Mercy looked down at Hope, whose unfocused gaze had somehow found Jacob's face. Even in the firelight there was no mistaking those pale blue orbs that seemed to look straight through him. "Those aren't my eyes," Jacob whispered, backing away as if the baby carried some contagion. "Those aren't my eyes at all." The terrible silence that followed was broken only by Hope's cries and the sound of Mercy's heart shattering as she finally understood what had always been true but never spoken. The silence stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Jacob stared at the baby in Mercy's arms as if she were some mythical creature that had materialized from his worst nightmares. Those pale blue eyes, so distinctly Ezra's, seemed to accuse him of sins he'd never confessed, even to himself. "That's impossible," Jacob breathed, but his voice carried the hollow ring of a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. "The timing, it has to be mine." Mercy's face had gone white as winter snow, her arms trembling as she held Hope closer. "Jacob, please, just leave us alone." "No." His voice cracked like a teenager's, all his practiced charm stripped away to reveal the petulant boy beneath. "No, this is wrong. This is all wrong." He whirled on Ezra, his finger jabbing accusingly. "You? What did you do to her? How did you—" "I never touched her," Ezra said quietly, his rifle still trained on the intruders. "Not once. Not ever. Your child was already growing when her father brought her to me." "Then explain those eyes." Jacob's voice rose to a near shriek. "Explain how my child looks like you." The hired men shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this domestic drama to take such a bizarre turn. One of them, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Ashford, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Jacob snarled, his composure completely shattered. "Can't you see what's happened here? This savage has corrupted everything, even my own flesh and blood." It was Mercy who finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "She was never yours, Jacob." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Jacob's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, denial, dawning horror, and finally a rage so pure it seemed to light him from within. "What are you saying?" Mercy's tears fell silently onto Hope's downy head. "The night before I told you about the baby, do you remember where you were?" Jacob's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He did remember. A bachelor party for one of his college friends, drinking and gambling until dawn, stumbling home with no memory of how he'd gotten there. "Your friend?" Mercy continued, her voice growing stronger even as her heart broke. "Thomas Mitchell. He walked me home from choir practice that Thursday night, said you'd asked him to make sure I got safely home since you couldn't be there." The color drained from Jacob's face. "Tommy wouldn't. He's my friend. He said you'd understand. Said it was what friends did for each other." Mercy's voice turned bitter as old coffee. "He was very persuasive, very insistent that you'd want him to take care of me." The hired man with tobacco-stained teeth took a step back, clearly wanting no part of whatever revelation was unfolding. Even his partner, a younger man with dead eyes, looked uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation had taken. "You're lying," Jacob said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Tommy's been my friend since childhood. He wouldn't—" "Ask him," Mercy suggested quietly. "Ask him about the night he walked me home. Ask him what he thought friendship meant." Jacob's legs seemed to give out beneath him. He sank into one of Ezra's hand-carved chairs, his head in his hands. Oh, God, Mercy, I'm so sorry. I never meant—" "I thought he was helping—" "Helping himself," Ezra observed grimly, "while you were too drunk to notice or care." "But the eyes," Jacob whispered, looking up at Hope with something approaching horror. "If she's not mine, and you never, then how?" Mercy met Ezra's gaze across the tension-filled room, seeing understanding pass between them like electricity. The truth was simpler and more wonderful than Jacob could possibly comprehend. "Sometimes," Ezra said slowly, "children choose their own fathers." It was an impossible statement, yet somehow it felt more true than anything else that had been spoken in that cabin. Hope had been conceived in violence and shame, but in the months since Mercy's arrival, something had changed. The baby had grown not just in her mother's womb, but in the protective circle of Ezra's quiet care. She had absorbed his gentleness, his patient strength, his pale-eyed way of seeing straight through to the heart of things. "That's impossible," Jacob said again, but his protest lacked fire. "Is it?" Mercy asked softly. "You know what they say about mountain magic, Cherokee wisdom. Maybe some truths can't be explained by white man's science." Hope chose that moment to open her eyes fully, fixing her startling blue gaze on Ezra's face. A smile, the first of her young life, flickered across her tiny features, and Ezra's granite composure cracked completely. Tears rolled down his weathered cheeks as he looked at this child who had somehow claimed him as completely as if he'd been present at her conception. "Well, I'll be damned," the tobacco-stained hired man muttered. "Kid does look like him." "Genetics don't work that way," his partner objected, but even he sounded uncertain. "Maybe not," the older man replied. "But I've seen stranger things in these mountains. Cherokee always said the spirits choose where souls land. Maybe this little one's spirit just knew where it belonged." Jacob stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "This is insane. All of it. Mercy, you've let this place corrupt your mind with superstitious nonsense." "Have I?" Mercy asked, her voice steady as mountain stone. "Or have I finally learned to recognize truth when I see it?" "The truth is that you're living in squalor with a man who's filled your head with primitive folklore." Jacob's voice rose again, desperation making him cruel. "The truth is that you're ruining your life and condemning your child to grow up ignorant and savage." Hope began to cry. Not the thin wails of distress, but the demanding cry of a baby who knew exactly what she wanted. Mercy began to rock her gently, humming a lullaby her grandmother had taught her years ago. The Cherokee melody seemed to wrap around the cabin like a protective blanket, and gradually Hope settled back into peaceful sleep. "Listen to yourself," Ezra said quietly. "Calling a healing song savage, calling the love that's kept your child safe for all these months squalor. What kind of civilized man speaks of an innocent baby that way?" "She's not innocent," Jacob exploded, then stopped in horror at his own words. "I mean, she's the product of what Tommy did. She's perfect," Mercy said firmly. "Whatever brought her into this world, she's perfect. And she's exactly where she belongs." Jacob stared at mother and child for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was hollow with defeat. "You really choose this? Choose him over everything I could give you?" "I choose love over possession," Mercy replied. "I choose partnership over ownership. I choose a man who sees me as a person rather than a prize to be won. And I choose a father who'll love this child not because she carries his blood, but because she carries his heart," Mercy added, meeting Ezra's eyes. "Because that's what real family is, not the accidents of birth, but the choices we make every day to protect and cherish each other." Jacob's shoulders sagged as if the fight had gone out of him entirely. "I loved you. I really did love you." "I know," Mercy said gently. "But you loved the idea of me more than the reality. You loved having me, not being with me." The hired men holstered their weapons, clearly recognizing that whatever they'd been paid to do here was no longer possible. The tobacco-stained one touched his hat brim respectfully. "Ma'am, Mr. Ironwolf, no disrespect intended. We'll be heading back down the mountain now." Jacob nodded numbly, following them toward the shattered door like a sleepwalker. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. "I hope you'll be happy," he said. And for the first time since she'd known him, Mercy heard genuine sincerity in his voice. "I hope she grows up strong and loved." "She will," Ezra promised. "I'll see to that." After they left, the cabin fell into peaceful silence, broken only by Hope's soft breathing and the whisper of wind through the broken door. Ezra set aside his rifle and knelt beside Mercy's chair, his large hand gently touching the baby's downy head. "Think he'll cause more trouble?" Mercy asked. "No," Ezra replied with certainty. "That man finally saw himself clearly tonight. Sometimes that's enough to change everything." Hope stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand reaching out to wrap around Ezra's finger with surprising strength. He looked down at her with wonder. This child who had somehow chosen him across all the barriers of biology and circumstance. "Daddy?" Mercy whispered, testing the word. "Sounds right," Ezra agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Sounds exactly right." Spring arrived like a benediction, melting the winter's harsh grip on the mountain and revealing a world reborn. Hope was 6 months old now, sitting up with wobbly determination and reaching for everything within her grasp with chubby fingers that seemed designed for exploration. Her pale blue eyes had deepened to the exact shade of Ezra's, and her laugh, a sound like silver bells in mountain wind, had become the music that guided their days. Mercy stood in the garden, Hope strapped to her back in a carrier Ezra had woven from supple willow branches, watching her husband work the soil for their second season together. He moved with the same patient precision he brought to everything, preparing rows for corn and beans, squash, and the wild herbs that had become as familiar as old friends. "Ezra?" she called softly, the word still carrying wonder after all these months. They'd spoken their own vows beneath the autumn stars, with only hope and the mountain spirits as witnesses, but the bonds they'd forged felt more sacred than any ceremony performed in a church built by human hands. He straightened, wiping soil from his hands on the leather apron she'd sewn for him over the winter. "What is it?" "Pastor Michaels is coming up the trail." Ezra's expression didn't change, but she saw the subtle shift in his posture that meant he was calculating distances to weapons, escape routes, potential threats. 6 months of peace hadn't erased the wariness that had kept him alive through war and loss. But when the circuit preacher emerged from the tree line, he was alone and riding a gentle mare that had seen better days. Pastor Michaels was nothing like Mercy's father, soft where Abraham had been hard, round where he had been angular, with kind eyes that held genuine compassion rather than righteous judgment. "Morning, folks," he called, removing his hat as he approached. "Beautiful day the Lord has given us." "Pastor," Ezra nodded, relaxing slightly but keeping his hands free. "You're a long way from your usual circuit." "Indeed I am." The preacher dismounted with a grunt, his knees protesting the long ride. "I've come with news, though I'm not certain whether it's good or bad." Mercy felt hope shift against her back, the baby making soft cooing sounds at the sight of a new face. "What kind of news?" Pastor Michael's expression grew grave. "Your father passed 3 days ago, Mrs. Ironwolf. Consumption finally took him, though he fought it to the very end." The words hit Mercy like cold mountain water, washing through her with complicated currents of grief and relief. She'd made her peace with Abraham Whiteheart months ago, understanding that his harsh choices had been born from love twisted by desperation and approaching death. But knowing someone was dying and hearing of their death were different things entirely. "How did he—" she began, then stopped, unsure what question she really wanted to ask. "Peacefully," Pastor Michaels assured her. "At the end, he spoke of you often, wanted me to tell you he was sorry for the pain he caused, but not sorry for keeping you safe." Ezra moved closer, his hand settling on Mercy's shoulder with gentle strength. "Safe from what?" The preacher's expression darkened. "That's the other part of my news, and I'm afraid it's more troubling. There's been talk in the settlements, rumors about Jacob Ashford and his friend Thomas Mitchell." Mercy's blood turned to ice. "What kind of rumors?" "The kind that get men hanged if they're proven true." Pastor Michaels glanced meaningfully at Hope, who was babbling cheerfully at a butterfly that had landed on Mercy's shoulder. "It seems young Mitchell has been indiscreet about his conquests. Bragging in taverns about the minister's daughter he'd claimed. Said he'd done it to spite Jacob, who'd always gotten everything handed to him." The butterfly flew away, but Hope's attention had shifted to the preacher's silver hair, gleaming in the sunlight. Her small hands reached toward him with the fearless curiosity of the completely innocent. "There's more," Pastor Michaels continued, his voice heavy with distaste. "Other girls have come forward. Young women from good families who'd been walking home alone and found themselves victims of Mitchell's particular brand of friendship. It seems your encounter was not isolated." Mercy felt the earth shift beneath her feet. All these months, she'd carried the shame of that night like a stone in her chest, believing herself somehow complicit in what had happened. To learn that she'd been just one of many, that Thomas Mitchell had made a practice of preying on innocent girls. Where is he now? Ezra's voice carried the dangerous quiet that made smart men step carefully. "Dead," Pastor Michaels replied bluntly. "Shot 3 days ago by a father whose daughter couldn't live with the shame. Jacob Ashford was with him when it happened." "Jacob's dead too?" Mercy whispered. "No, but he might as well be. Word is he knew what his friend was doing and did nothing to stop it. Said he was too much of a coward to stand up to his father about marrying you because he knew the truth would come out eventually. The scandal has destroyed Mayor Ashford's political career and driven Jacob from Tennessee entirely." Hope chose that moment to reach out and grab a handful of the preacher's hair, tugging with enough force to make him wince. But instead of pulling away, Pastor Michaels smiled with genuine warmth. "Strong grip," he observed. "Takes after her father, I'd say." He looked directly at Ezra as he said it, and Mercy realized that whatever magic had transformed Hope from Thomas Mitchell's violence into Ezra Ironwolf's daughter was visible to eyes that knew how to see truth. "Your grandmother would have understood," Pastor Michaels told Mercy quietly. "Sarah Crowfeather always said that spirits choose their own paths regardless of how they enter this world. She'd be proud to see how this little one has claimed her place in the circle of love." "You knew my grandmother?" Mercy asked, surprised. "Knew her and learned from her. She taught me that healing comes in many forms and that sometimes the greatest wounds require the strongest medicine." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather pouch. "She asked me to hold this for you, said you'd need it when the time was right." Mercy opened the pouch with trembling fingers and gasped. Inside lay her grandmother's medicine bundle. Herbs and stones, tiny carved figures and strips of bark inscribed with Cherokee symbols she barely remembered learning. At the bottom, wrapped in soft doeskin, was a small wooden flute that had belonged to her great-grandmother. "She said to tell you that healing knowledge skips no generations," Pastor Michaels continued. "That what was taken from you by fear would be returned by love." Hope had released the preacher's hair and was now reaching for the medicine bundle, her pale eyes bright with interest. When Mercy held it where she could see it, the baby's face lit up with recognition, as if these sacred objects were old friends she'd been waiting to meet again. "There's one more thing," Pastor Michaels said, his tone shifting to something more formal. "Your father left papers, a will, properly witnessed, leaving everything to you, the parsonage, his savings, even his collection of books. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to ensure this little one has opportunities when she's ready for them." Mercy looked around at the mountain home they'd built together, the garden bursting with new life, the cabin where Hope had been born, the peaceful valley that had become their sanctuary. "I don't need anything from that old life." "Perhaps not," the preacher agreed, "but Hope might someday. Education, dowry, the choice to see the world beyond these mountains if she wants to. Your father understood that love sometimes means providing options, even if you hope they're never needed." As Pastor Michaels prepared to leave, he pulled a small book from his coat. "One last gift from your father, his personal Bible, with notes he made over the years. He wanted you to see that faith and love aren't always the same thing, but when they work together, they can move mountains." That evening, As Hope slept peacefully in the cradle Ezra had carved with his own hands, Mercy sat by the fire reading her father's careful annotations in the margins of Scripture. Abraham Whiteheart had been a hard man, driven by fear and rigid certainty. But in his private moments with God's Word, she found evidence of doubt, questioning, and ultimately, a love so fierce it had been willing to sacrifice everything, including his daughter's understanding, to keep her safe. "Any regrets?" Ezra asked, settling beside her with 2 cups of the chamomile tea that had become their evening ritual. Mercy looked around their simple home, at Hope sleeping peacefully, at the man who had chosen to love them both despite every reason to protect his heart from further breaking. "Only one," she said quietly. "I wish my father could have lived to see how perfectly everything worked out." "Maybe he can," Ezra replied, pulling her close. "Mountain spirits aren't the only ones who watch over those they love." Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing the world clean for whatever tomorrow might bring. Message for American seniors, 55 to 68. Sometimes the greatest blessings come disguised as the worst punishments. In 1889, Mercy Whiteheart thought her life was over when her father forced her into marriage with a mountain stranger to hide her shame. But what looked like abandonment became salvation. What felt like exile became homecoming. Ezra Ironwolf, haunted by his own losses, discovered that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing love over fear again and again. Their story reminds us that family isn't always blood. It's the people who choose to stay when staying gets hard. At any age, we can choose forgiveness over bitterness, hope over regret. Like Mercy learning her grandmother's healing wisdom or Ezra finding fatherhood in his 50s, our greatest chapters might still be unwritten. The mountain taught them that resilience isn't about avoiding storms, it's about learning to dance in the rain. Their love story proves that sometimes what breaks us also makes us, and that it's never too late to discover who we were meant to become. Questions. What unexpected blessing emerged from your life's most difficult chapter? How has choosing forgiveness over resentment changed your perspective on family and love? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The years passed like water over mountain stones, wearing away sharp edges and leaving something smoother, stronger in their wake. Hope grew like a wildflower, all knees and elbows and endless questions, her pale blue eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that drove her parents to distraction and delight in equal measure. By her 5th birthday, she could identify every edible plant on the mountain, help Ezra set snares for rabbits, and sing Cherokee lullabies in a voice sweet as honey from their own hives. "Mama, why don't I have brothers and sisters like the children in town?" Hope asked one morning as she helped Mercy gather eggs from their expanding flock of chickens. Her small hands were gentle with the warm shells, careful not to crack the precious cargo. Mercy paused in her work, feeling the familiar ache that came with this question. There had been other pregnancies over the years, brief sparks of hope that flickered and died before they could take hold. Each loss had carved a small hollow in her heart, but she'd learned to fill those empty spaces with gratitude for the miracle of hope herself. "Sometimes families are meant to be small and perfect," Mercy replied, smoothing her daughter's dark hair, "like a precious gem that shines brighter because it's rare. But Mrs. Henderson has 6 children, and they seem happy enough." "Different families, different blessings." Ezra's voice came from behind them as he emerged from the barn with milk pails full of cream so rich it would make butter that would last them through the week. "Besides, you've got all the mountain creatures for brothers and sisters. That raccoon family in the old oak, the fox kits we watch in the meadow, even that ornery old bear who raids our berry bushes every summer." Hope giggled, the sound still capable of transforming Ezra's weathered features into something approaching boyish joy. Bears aren't brothers, Papa. They're too big and smelly. You haven't smelled your cousin Timothy after a day of fishing, Mercy observed, and they all laughed together in the way that families do when they're completely comfortable in each other's presence. The mention of cousins brought a bittersweet pang. Over the years, they'd established tentative connections with the scattered remnants of both their families. Mercy's cousin Rachel had married a kind man who didn't mind his wife maintaining correspondence with the mountain hermits, and she sent letters twice a year filled with news of births and deaths, marriages and scandals. Ezra's brother Samuel had survived the war and settled in Virginia, and though they'd never met, he sent packages at Christmas containing books for Hope and practical things like good steel needles and lamp oil. "Are we going to town for the Harvest Festival this year?" Hope asked, though she already knew the answer. They made the journey down the mountain twice each year, once for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves, and once for the harvest celebration that marked the turning of the seasons. "If you promise not to ask Mrs. Peterson when her baby is due," Mercy said sternly. "The poor woman isn't expecting, just well fed, but her belly is so round." "Hope Ironwolf, that is exactly the kind of comment that gets young ladies in trouble." Hope ducked her head, properly chastened, but Mercy caught the gleam of mischief still dancing in her eyes. At 5, Hope possessed a combination of Cherokee wisdom and mountain wildness that made her simultaneously the most delightful and most exhausting child Mercy had ever encountered. The Harvest Festival was everything Hope remembered and more. The settlement of Cedar Falls had grown in the years since they'd first ventured down from their mountain sanctuary, drawing families displaced by economic hardship and young couples seeking their fortunes in timber and mining. The festival brought them all together in the town square, where tables groaned under the weight of preserves and pies, roasted corn and fresh cider. Hope danced between the adults like a small whirlwind, her Cherokee features and mountain-pale eyes drawing curious glances from newcomers who whispered questions to longtime residents. But the people of Cedar Falls had long since accepted the Ironwolf family as part of their community, and more than one mother sought Mercy's advice about childhood ailments or difficult births. "You should consider moving down here," Dr. Williams suggested as he watched Mercy treat a child's infected cut with herbs and honey. "The town could use someone with your healing knowledge." "The mountain is our home," Mercy replied gently, the same answer she'd given for 5 years running. "But we'll always come when we're needed." It was true. Word of Mercy's healing gifts had spread through the mountain communities like wildfire, and hardly a month passed without someone making the difficult journey to their cabin, seeking remedies for everything from consumption to broken hearts. Mercy never turned anyone away, though she insisted on payment in work or goods rather than money. Their root cellar overflowed with preserves from grateful patients, and their barn housed tools and household goods traded for tinctures and poultices. As the afternoon wore on, Hope found herself drawn to a group of children playing near the church. Most were older than her, sons and daughters of the town's merchants and farmers, but they accepted her readily enough when she proved she could climb trees faster and catch fireflies better than any of them. "My ma says your ma was pregnant before she got married," one boy said with the casual cruelty of childhood. "Says that makes you a bastard." Hope considered this gravely, her pale eyes studying the boy's face with an intensity that made him fidget. "My ma says that makes me special. Says I chose my own papa instead of getting stuck with whatever man provided the seed." "That's not how babies work," another child protested. "How would you know?" Hope asked reasonably. "Have you ever been a baby who got to choose?" The logic was so perfect in its simplicity that the other children fell silent, and the conversation moved on to safer topics like whose father could split wood faster and whether the new teacher would be as mean as the old one. But Mercy had overheard the exchange, and that evening as they made camp in the field outside town, she found herself struggling with familiar doubts. "Did we do the right thing?" she asked Ezra as they watched Hope chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Keeping her here, away from other children, from opportunities we can't give her?" Ezra was quiet for so long that Mercy thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years spent wrestling with the same questions. "I've been thinking about my son, Samuel," he said. "My real son, the one Morning Star took when she left. He'd be 17 now if he's still alive, old enough to make his own choices about which world he wants to belong to." Mercy waited, sensing there was more. "I used to think I failed him by not being able to give him both worlds without conflict. Cherokee and white, mountain and valley, wild and civilized. But watching Hope grow up here, seeing how she navigates between your grandmother's wisdom and the town children's games—" He paused, smiling as Hope successfully caught a particularly large firefly and held it up for their admiration. "I think maybe the gift isn't choosing one world or another. Maybe the gift is learning to build a bridge between them. And if she decides she wants more than bridges, if she wants colleges and cities and things we can't give her, then we'll find a way to give them to her," Ezra said simply. "That's what parents do. We give our children roots strong enough to grow anywhere, and wings brave enough to fly." Hope came running back to them, her cupped hands glowing with captured fireflies. "Look, I caught enough light to read by." "What would you read?" Mercy asked, playing along with the game. "The story about the princess who lived in a tower and waited for someone to rescue her," Hope said, then wrinkled her nose in disgust. "Except I'd change the ending. The princess would rescue herself and then help other people who were stuck in towers." Ezra and Mercy exchanged glances over their daughter's head, and Mercy felt her worries dissolve like morning mist. Hope would indeed write her own endings, build her own bridges, choose her own adventures. And whatever path she chose, she'd walk it with the strength of mountains in her bones and the wisdom of 2 worlds in her heart. As they settled in for the night under a canopy of stars, Hope curled between them like a small animal seeking warmth. Mercy reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this moment. From shame and abandonment to love and belonging, from broken pieces to a family stronger than any storm. "Thank you," she whispered to Ezra in the darkness. "For what?" "For choosing us, for staying, for showing me that sometimes the best families are the ones we build from scratch." His arm tightened around them both. "Thank you for letting me." And in the morning, they would return to their mountain, to the life they'd carved from wilderness and will. But tonight, under stars that had witnessed their journey from strangers to family, they rested in the certainty that love, once freely given, could indeed move mountains.